welcome back to Dragon Dreams. I'm Ivan, and today on Dragon Dreams, I'm going to be talking about ancient Greek priests and how we might interpret them in a role-playing game. So, I have a BA in Greco-Roman Classics from Reed College 96. So that means that I have quite a bit of expertise on ancient Greek culture, and I was very interested in ancient Greek religion particularly. It was something that really fascinated me about it. So I tended to kind of be more expert on that than other subjects. Now, of course, I'm not a PhD, so don't necessarily take my word as being academic fact. I'm going to tell you things based on what I remember studying when I was at reading, what I've done in some of my reading since, because it's been an ongoing interest of mine. So I'm going to talk about the historical priests, first of all. Then I'm going to talk about religious beliefs that they actually had. Finally, I'll talk about how we might interpret that in a role-playing game, both a realistic role-playing game, where you try to realistically interpret their belief system, and a high fantasy role-playing game where you have cleric spells and stuff like that. Okay, so let's get to it. Let's start out with the historical priest. So the historical priest, first of all, was not necessarily like a lifelong occupation. In fact, in many city-states, they were either elected or appointed, depending on how the city-state government worked. And yes, you heard that right. So priesthoods were part of the government, basically. Sort of everything was kind of part of the government. They didn't really have a concept of separation of church and state or freedom of religion. Like, very institutional. I mean, absolutely, completely institutional. And so becoming a cleric, or really a priest, they wouldn't say cleric, a priest, was really more like becoming dog catcher. Whatever the rules are for becoming dog catcher in your area, that's how you become one. And so it's basically, you're like, hey guys, I'm really expert in worshiping Apollo. I know the right times of year to make different offerings and what kind of offerings you should get and stuff. Then you could get appointed. Now, you might also have to or be expected to have some sort of education from the priesthood. But it's kind of more of a meritocracy than I think a lot of people realize. Their primary duty was to make sure that the rites got done. So there should be festivals at certain times of year, marking different dates on kind of the mythological calendar of the deities. So, for example, with Apollo, there's a time when he goes to the land of the Hyperboreans, a time when he comes back. There's his birthday, various things like that. And in addition, you probably would have ongoing regular offerings. And then in addition to that, if somebody came to your temple and wanted to worship the deity, you would help that person do it. So they'd come to you and you'd say, this is what I want the god to do for me. And you'd say, okay, let's perform a rite together, and you provide the offerings, and these are the offerings that you need that are prescribed, and then we will do it. Additional responsibilities. Sometimes they served as oracles, meaning that they were believed to be able to actually have the deity or deities speak to them and tell them things. The oracle answers were often kind of cryptic and in the form of riddles. Usually these were specialists. Okay, so the Delphic oracle was a specialist within the Temple of Delphi. Not all of the priests of the Temple of Delphi were oracles. Then they'd have responsibility to their city-state, to do their part in whatever it was the city-state got out of having that temple, or believed they would get out of having that temple. So let's say you're working in the temple of Demeter, the agriculture goddess. Then you do your part in making sure that there was a bountiful harvest. Now, that does not mean that bad things are going to happen to you if the harvest fails. I'll talk a little bit about that later because they escalate things a little bit. But I think they were logical people. I don't think that they really thought that the only possible reason why a harvest would fail is because Demeter was angry at them. They thought that was possible. That was one of the factors. But obviously, if there's just not enough seeds, there's not enough people to work the land, they kind of knew, well, obviously there's human error can cause things to just go wrong. Just bad luck in other ways could cause things to go wrong. So it's not like they thought that the only possible explanation for not having a good harvest was that the goddess was angry at them. So your responsibility is to do what is necessary for that part of the agriculture effort. One thing I should probably make clear, because it's not clear to everybody, is that rather than so much being oriented toward prayers to the gods, they're oriented toward offerings. Okay, they did make prayers, but much more often they made offerings. So an offering could be some resin, like frankincense, like a incense, basically. It could be something like offering wine or milk or honey. It could also be animal sacrifices, but they actually cooked and ate the meat of the animals they sacrificed. So that was their historical function. Okay, and next I'm going to talk about their belief system. I already talked about oracles. Okay, so obviously one of their beliefs was that some of the priests who were specialists had the ability to receive messages from the deities. And sometimes these were in the form of just kind of receiving it through some sort of ritual. So, for example, the Delphic oracle sat over this gas that came out of Delphi, and it turns out we now know that it actually was hallucinogenic gas and would hallucinate. But other things were a little bit more, a little bit like throwing the bones or throwing the runes or something like that. They had things like that, divination techniques like that. One really strange one that I heard is that Apollo Smintheus, Apollo of the mice, that the Apollo temple sometimes kept mice, and they would let them escape, and the pattern they made when they ran off meant something. Okay, they might look at the flight of birds, things like that, to gain omens. Okay, and they would try to find out what the deity wanted from them and get a sense of what was going to happen in the future. So another thing that they believed is that any of the priests could influence how the deity favored the state or favored a particular person who had come to the temple through worship and specifically offerings to the deities, through keeping up their festivals, through like basically like holidays for them, and so forth. Okay, so obviously, like let's say again you're a priest of Demeter, then you would have the ability, they believed, to make the harvest yield more. So maybe, well, this might be more a matter of luck. It might be like you're more likely to have a bountiful harvest. The harvest increase might be, not obviously tremendous because they weren't typically going to get a real bumper crop. I mean, they're not going to get like miraculous level bumper crops in reality. They're going to get whatever they get, right? So they probably didn't believe that it was like Demeter's going to make their crops yield tenfold or anything as drastic as that. Maybe more like an additional 10%, maybe more like slightly above average, maybe even sort of more like if we do our job, we'll get a harvest. We'll get the harvest that we need as opposed to having a drought or something like that. Okay, so they were maybe staving off disaster. Okay, for the entire city-state, as well as for individual people who came and they help. I have a farm. I want a bountiful harvest. Okay, great. Here's the offerings you make. You're good. They typically either made offerings into the fire if we're talking about mountain deities or sky deities like the Olympians, or into the earth if we're either dealing with earth deities like Demeter, or underworld deities like Hades. First of all, I think for a realistic game that had the concept that the beliefs the ancient Greeks had are actually true, I would probably handle it to make them a little bit skewed more toward fighters, and here's why. Most young men went through military training. So what that means is that a male priest was probably going to be very well trained militarily. Now, I'm not going to apologize for ancient Greek's concept of gender. I'm sorry, it was a patriarchal culture. Um, you know, that's the reality. Now, obviously, if we want to do ancient Greece, we want to do ancient Greece as it should have been, not as it was. In which case, I would say that, of course, like young women would also serve in the military if you wanted, if you were doing a campaign. So how I would interpret it is they should be able to use pretty much any weapons and any armor. They might have some taboos. I don't know whether they had taboos, actually. So the way I would do it in a more realistic fantasy campaign would be basically make them essentially start out as sort of like fighters. So basically almost more like paladins in the sense that in addition to being good at fighting, they would be good at increasing the percentage of something happening in society or for a particular person, basically increasing their luck in some way by making the proper offerings or by keeping up the correct calendar of holidays. So probably in the case of the city-state, you'd have to keep up the cycle of holidays, probably a particular person just doing the right offerings. They could, if they're a priest of Demeter, they can get, maybe like a plus 10% yield on the crops. If they are maybe, and only, it's not cumulative, you can only bless a field once, right? If they worship Hephaestus, you get bonus on smithing or something like that. You can confer bonuses on people on smithing. You can bless the smiths, something like that. Right, and then they would do a little bit better, but it wouldn't be a whole lot better. It would be like, as I said, maybe about like 10% better. So maybe they get like a +2 on their d20 roll or something like that. Wouldn't really have spells. It would be like you have to do this lengthy ritual and make offerings in order to get things to happen. So I would basically give them maybe kind of like a little bit less opportunities to advance as a fighter because they would not, like, they went through military training, but now they're priests, and that's what they're focused on. Okay, and then in addition, give them an option to be able to be an oracle. You could even make that standard. I mean, it wouldn't be exactly true to history, but to make them standard, but for a good game, I'd make it standard because it seems like they don't have a whole lot in my idea of a realistic ancient Greek priest. But this would give the opportunity for the GM to communicate the will of their deity, even maybe send them on adventures. So how would they work in a high fantasy game? So here, this is where you'd have, cleric spells and all, these kind of things. You'd have the cleric spells that would make sense for them to have. I would say, in addition to that, give them the powers that I already said that we'd have in the realistic game. They have some ability to increase the crop yield or how good blacksmiths are, something like that, by approximately a +2. But they could do that for the entire city-state by, maybe once a year by following the good ritual cycle. And, in like a single day over a several hour ritual with the proper offerings for an individual person. And secondly, I would say either give them the option for oracles or just allow them to be oracles. And thirdly, though, I would, to counterbalance some of these new abilities, I would basically make it so that in order to have upkeep on getting their clerical spells or getting turn undead, for example, they would have to keep up with their offerings and keep up with the festival. And also, maybe if things get really bad and they fail to provide, their state might ask them to do something like a Holocaust offering. So a Holocaust offering is basically, as I said, normally they cooked and ate the meat of the animals they sacrificed, but a Holocaust offering is like you offer an entire bull just to that god, and it's just, the whole thing is just incinerated. But it would never be something like, you have to sacrifice your firstborn daughter or something. That wasn't how it worked. In conclusion, I think that several of the highlights here is, first of all, that this is a religion that is heavy in offerings. So there would be a lot of offerings being made to the deities, and a lot of rituals and festivals that need to be caught up with or kept up with in the year. Okay, and so that should definitely be in there. Now, I also think, in addition, the idea that they are basically state sponsored and are responsible to the state and have responsibilities for the welfare of the state is, another thing that should be important in there. Um, and the idea that they would have kind of low level but very broad powers that could increase the luck um, in a small amount over an entire city state. And finally, the concept that they had oracles, that they believed that they could commune with the deities, and the deities could tell them things. I think that would be an important part for at least some specialists to have. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please let me know what you think in the comments. How would you, based on what I've said, what are your thoughts on game mechanics? Because I'm more expert in classics than I am in game mechanics. You may have better ideas for how to implement those using game mechanics, and I'd love to chat about it. All right, until next time, happy dreaming, everybody.